The morning of his wedding, Jace Holloway stood in front of a cracked mirror in the back room of Harlan's only church and tried to remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal. He couldn't. The suit he was wearing had belonged to his father. Dale Holloway had been broader in the chest and shorter in the leg, so Jace stood there with his wrists hanging 2 inches past the cuffs and the trousers riding high on his boots. He'd tried to press the jacket the night before, but the iron had a broken handle, and he'd burned a pale brown stripe across the left lapel. He'd turned the lapel under and hoped no one would notice. Someone would notice. He was 22 years old. He felt about 60. Outside the narrow window, he could hear the town gathering. Harlan wasn't a large place. Maybe 400 souls if you counted the homesteaders scattered out past the creek line. But on a day like this, it felt like every single one of them had put on their good clothes and come in to watch. He could hear their voices drifting through the warped wooden wall. The low murmur of people who weren't sure whether they were attending a wedding or a funeral and had decided it didn't much matter which. "You don't have to do this." Jace turned. His younger sister Clara was standing in the doorway. She was 17 with their mother's narrow face and their father's stubborn jaw, and she'd been crying, though she was working hard to pretend she hadn't. Her eyes were red at the rims. She'd twisted a handkerchief into a tight rope between her fingers. "Yeah," Jace said. "I do. There's got to be another way. I've been looking for another way for 8 months." He turned back to the mirror and adjusted the lapel again. Useless. "There isn't one." Clara crossed the room and stood beside him, and for a moment they both looked at their reflections. She reached up and straightened his collar. Her hands were shaking slightly. "She's 41 years old, Jace." "I know how old she is. People are saying, I don't care what people are saying. They're saying she poisoned her first husband." Jace was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Edgar Voss died of a chest infection. The doctor signed the death certificate himself. Dr. Aldrich signs whatever Harlan Croft tells him to sign." That was true, and Jace didn't have a good answer for it, so he said nothing. He looked at his own face in the mirror. He'd always thought he looked younger than he was. Too much of his mother's soft features, not enough of his father's hard-carved angles. Right now he thought he looked exactly his age, which was to say he looked like a young man who hadn't slept properly in the better part of a year and had just run out of options. "The note said 60 days, Clara said quietly. "Maybe if we just—" The note said 60 days 8 months ago. Croft extended it twice because he thought he could get more out of waiting. "He's done waiting, Clara. He's got a buyer for the east pasture already. If I don't sign those papers today, we lose the whole ranch by the end of the month." He paused. "You understand what that means? Where we'd go." She understood. She didn't say anything. "Mrs. Voss, Evelyn, she's agreed to settle the full debt. All of it. $13,000. He said the number like it still had weight, because it did. "In exchange for the marriage." He turned away from the mirror. "So that's what we're doing." Clara pressed her lips together. A tear escaped down one cheek and she wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. "I just think you deserve better than this." "Maybe." Jace picked up his father's hat from the chair, a flat-crowned affair with a band that had gone dark with years of sweat, and turned it in his hands once. Dad deserved better than dying at 53 with the bank breathing down his neck, too. Doesn't always work out the way you deserve. He put the hat on, looked at himself one last time. "Stay close today," he said, "and don't talk to Croft if you can help it." Harlan Croft was already in the church when Jace walked down the center aisle. He was sitting in the second pew, on the groom's side, which was either an insult or a joke. Jace couldn't decide which. Croft was 50-something, heavy in the middle, with a gray beard he kept trimmed close, and a way of sitting that suggested he considered every chair he occupied to be his personal property. He was wearing a good black coat and a silver watch chain, and when Jace passed him, he nodded with a small, satisfied smile that made Jace want to put his fist through the wall. He didn't. He kept walking. The minister, a thin older man named Forsyth, who delivered both Dale Holloway's eulogy and, as far as Jace knew, every other significant ceremonial occasion in Harlan for the past 20 years, was waiting at the front with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. He gave Jace a look that might have been sympathetic. Jace nodded at him and took his place. The church was fuller than he'd expected, 3/4 of the pews maybe. He recognized most of the faces. The Brennan family from the mill, the widow Hartley and her unmarried daughters, old Pete Sue Grew, who'd been a friend of his father's back when Dale was still alive, and things were different, a scatter of ranchers and shopkeepers and their wives. They were watching him with the particular kind of attention that towns reserve for spectacles they didn't know quite how to feel about. He heard the door open at the back and turned without meaning to. She walked in, without ceremony. Evelyn Voss was wearing a dark gray dress, not black, not quite, with a high collar and no lace. Her hair was dark brown, threaded through with silver at the temples, pinned back simply. She was carrying no flowers. She had no attendant with her. She walked the length of the aisle at an even pace, neither rushing nor dragging it out, her eyes on the front of the church, and the murmur that moved through the gathered crowd at her entrance was low and hard to read. She was a handsome woman, in a way that had nothing to do with softness. There were lines at the corners of her eyes and around her mouth. Not from smiling, Jace thought, but from something else. Watching. Calculating. She held herself the way a person holds themselves when they've learned not to show what they're thinking, and she did it with the ease of long practice. She stopped beside him. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were a gray-green that reminded him of creek water in November. Not cold exactly, but still in a way that still water gets when the season is turning and you can't quite tell what's under the surface. "Mr. Holloway," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried. "Mrs. Voss," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, two strangers on the edge of something neither of them had chosen, and then Forsyth cleared his throat and opened his book. The ceremony was short. Forsyth didn't embellish it, which Jace was grateful for. He spoke the words he was supposed to speak. She spoke hers. When Forsyth asked if anyone present had cause to object, the silence in the church was so complete that Jace could hear the wind pushing against the clapboard outside. Nobody objected. He put a plain band on her finger. She had brought it herself, in a small cotton pouch. He didn't know where it had come from, and didn't ask. Forsyth said, "You may kiss the bride," and then caught himself and looked at Jace with a flicker of something, embarrassment maybe, and added, "If you wish." Jace glanced at Evelyn. She met his eyes, and there was a brief, expressionless beat, and then she turned her cheek toward him very slightly. He pressed his lips to it for a second. Her skin was cool and smelled faintly of something herbal he didn't recognize. Not perfume, something older than perfume. When he straightened, Croft was already on his feet in the second pew, buttoning his coat with the look of a man who'd just closed a profitable deal. He caught Jace's eye across the room and smiled. It was a wide, generous smile that had nothing generous behind it. Jace held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he took his new wife's arm and walked out of the church. The Voss homestead sat 4 miles east of Harlan, set back from the main road behind a long, straight run of post and rail fence that needed paint but was otherwise sound. The house itself was 2 stories, built from good timber, with a covered porch running the full width of the front. By Harlan standards, it was comfortable. By the standards Jace had grown up with, the Holloway Ranch had been a working cattle operation with 300 head before the debts started mounting. It was modest, but it was standing. That was more than he could say for home. He arrived with his single bag in the early afternoon, driving the old buckboard with the roan mare that had somehow survived everything. Evelyn had come ahead of him. Her horse was already in the small stable. When he climbed down and tied the mare, he stood in the yard for a moment and took stock. A kitchen garden along the south wall, well maintained. A root cellar with a new-looking door. The woodpile was low for the season, which was something he could fix. The fence along the east side of the property needed a section replaced. He could see where a post had rotted and been propped rather than pulled. He pulled his bag from the buckboard and went inside. She was at the kitchen table when he came through the back door. She had changed out of the gray dress and was wearing something simpler, a plain dark skirt and a cotton blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. There were papers spread on the table in front of her. Not documents he could read from the doorway, but densely written, with small, neat handwriting that covered every margin. She looked up when he came in. "Your room is upstairs," she said. "First door on the left. I'll need the right side of the room at the end of the hall." "That door stays closed." "All right," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want to be plain with you about something." "Go ahead." "This arrangement, what we did today, I don't have any illusions about what it is. I needed certain protections that marriage provides. You needed the debt settled. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm not in the habit of pretending. Something moved in her eyes, though her expression didn't change. She looked back at the papers in front of her. Good. Supper's at 7. There's well water through the back door. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. The debt is paid? Actually paid. I had Thomas Aberline at the bank handle it this morning. Croft's note is settled in full. You should receive written confirmation by the end of the week. And the ranch? The land is yours. I've made no claim to it, and I don't intend to. She turned over the paper she'd been reading and set it face down on the table. I don't want anything from your family's property, Mr. Holloway. Only what we agreed. He nodded slowly. Jace, he said. She looked up again. If we're going to live in the same house, you can call me Jace. A long pause. All right, she said. Jace. She didn't offer him her own first name in return, and he didn't ask for it. He went upstairs to find his room. It was 3 weeks before things went wrong. In those 3 weeks, Jace had settled into something that resembled a routine, though it was unlike any routine he'd ever kept. He rose early and did the work the property needed. The fence post replaced, the woodpile built up, the stable cleaned and reorganized, a section of roof on the south eave that had started to sag. There was more work than he'd first estimated, which was fine with him. Work had always been the thing that kept his head clear. Evelyn moved through the house with a quiet self-sufficiency that he found difficult to read. She cooked simply and well. She read in the evenings, usually from books she brought down from the locked room at the end of the hall, the door he'd been told to stay clear of. She occasionally asked him questions about the property in a tone that was direct without being cold, and she listened to his answers with real attention. She was not what he'd expected. He'd walked into that church expecting, he didn't know exactly, something fragile, something slightly used up by grief and isolation. Edgar Voss had died 2 years prior, and the town's version of Evelyn Voss was a woman who'd retreated from the world and taken her husband's money with her. What he found instead was someone who was entirely present, entirely purposeful, and very clearly occupied with something he wasn't being told about. He didn't push. It wasn't his way. But he watched. The papers on the kitchen table were always put away when he came in. The letters she received, and she received them regularly, more regularly than made sense for a woman supposedly living in isolation, were opened privately and disposed of without comment. Once he came in from the stable unexpectedly and found her standing at the kitchen window with a letter in one hand and the other hand flat on the counter, very still, in the posture of someone absorbing a blow. She heard him come in and turned around, and her face was entirely composed. Post came early, she said, and put the letter in her skirt pocket. He went to the sink and washed his hands and said nothing. It was a Tuesday evening when they came. Jace was in the stable, replacing a corroded latch on one of the stall doors when he heard the horses. Multiple horses, 4 at least, maybe more, moving fast and slowing as they hit the yard. He set down the latch and listened. The light was going gray. It was maybe 40 minutes before full dark. He came to the stable door and looked out. There were 5 of them. They'd come in from the north road rather than the main track, which wasn't the way anyone who meant something ordinary came to call. They were dressed rough, working clothes, not formal, and they were armed, which in itself meant nothing out here. But the way they were armed was particular. Rifles out, not slung, pistols visible. The lead man was already down from his horse and walking toward the house with his hand on his gun belt. Jace stayed in the shadow of the stable doorway and watched. The lead man knocked on the front door, hard. Not the way you knock when you're paying a social call. A pause, and then the door opened and Evelyn was there. From where Jace stood, he could see her in profile. Straight-backed, one hand on the doorframe, the other at her side. "Been a while, Nora," the lead man said, his voice carried in the evening quiet. Jace saw Evelyn's posture shift. Just a fraction, just a tightening, but he noticed it because he'd spent 3 weeks watching her. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "Sure you don't." The man stepped up onto the porch uninvited. "Connell wants what you took, you know that. This doesn't have to be difficult." "Get off my porch." "Come on, Nora, you've been running long enough." "My name is Evelyn Voss. This is private property. If you come inside this house, you'll be shot." The man stopped. Then he laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "With what?" "With whatever I have available." Her voice was absolutely flat. "I won't say it again." There was a moment, one of those moments where a situation could go in either direction, and then the lead man looked back at his companions, and something passed between them that Jace couldn't read from a distance. He took a step back from the door. "We'll be back," he said. "I expect you will." She didn't move from the doorway until they'd all remounted and ridden back out the way they'd come. Then she came inside and closed the door. Jace came out of the stable and crossed the yard. She was standing at the kitchen table when he came in. She'd lit the lamp. Her back was to him, and she was standing very still. "Who's Nora?" he said. A silence. Then she turned around. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something in them that he thought might be calculation. Not deceptive exactly, but the look of a person who is deciding how much of a truth to tell. "I should have told you before today," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You should have." She pulled out the kitchen chair across from where he was standing and sat down. She folded her hands on the table. "Sit down, Jace." He pulled out a chair and sat. "My name," she said, "was not always Evelyn Voss." He said nothing. He waited. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her organizing something. Not lying, he didn't think, but deciding how to arrange a truth that had a lot of pieces. "I was born Nora Callahan in Pennsylvania 31 years ago." She watched his face. "I was 23 when I came west. I had a different reason than most people do." She paused. "I had a job." "What kind of job?" "I worked for a man named Arthur Connell. He ran a freight operation out of Cheyenne officially. Unofficially, there were other things he ran." She stopped. "I was good with numbers, good with records. He hired me to manage the books for the parts of his business he didn't want looked at too carefully." Jace was very still. "You were working for a criminal." "I was young and I needed money, and I didn't understand the full extent of it at first." A pause. "And then I did understand it, and I stayed longer than I should have, because I was afraid. And then I found something." She set her hands flat on the table, then lifted them again, as though she wasn't quite sure what to do with them. "In the course of keeping those books, I found evidence. Correspondence, records of payments, government contracts that were fraudulent, witnesses who had died unexpectedly." She looked at him steadily. "Arthur Connell is not just a criminal. He is the kind of criminal who has made himself invisible by owning the people around him, judges, sheriffs, the men who were supposed to be looking." "So you took the evidence and ran?" "I made copies of everything I could. Then I ran, yes." She picked up the lamp and moved it slightly, adjusted the wick, though it didn't need adjusting. "Edgar Voss was a decent man who wanted a wife and didn't ask too many questions. I'm not proud of that. But I was trying to survive." She set the lamp back down. "Edgar died of a chest infection, in case you're wondering, exactly as it was recorded." "I wasn't wondering," he said, which was mostly true. "The men who came tonight work for Connell. They've been looking for me for 3 years. She met his eyes. "I didn't tell you any of this before we married because I needed the legal protection that marriage provides. A wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband, and some of those protections also shield a wife's property from being seized." He understood it now. "You needed a husband for legal cover." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the night had finished coming down and the yard was dark. "The evidence," he said. "You still have it." "Yes." "That's what's in the room at the end of the hall." She didn't confirm it or deny it. She just held his gaze. "Jace," her voice was careful, "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. These are not small-time men who will walk away quietly. The person above Connell, the money behind him, the man who actually controls the territory, his name is Vincent Blackthorne. He has resources you cannot imagine. He has been running this territory for 15 years. Blackthorne," he recognized the name. "The railroad man. Railroad is the public story. What he actually does with railroad money is something different." Jace looked at the kitchen table. There was a scratch in the wood, long and diagonal, that he'd noticed on his first day and never thought to ask about. He traced it with one finger now. "Those men will come back," he said. "Yes." "With more." "Probably." He leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under him. He thought about the ranch, about the east pasture and the creek that ran through it, and the barn he'd helped his father build when he was 12, and the look on Clara's face in the back room of the church that morning. He thought about a lot of things. "Tell me what the evidence says," he said. "All of it." She studied him for a long moment. He could feel her reading him the way she read everything, carefully, without rushing. Then she stood up and went to the kitchen shelf and came back with a glass and a bottle of whiskey. She poured 2 glasses without asking if he wanted one and sat back down. "It's complicated," she said. "I've got time." She picked up her glass. He picked up his. Outside somewhere, an owl started calling across the dark. That low, repetitive sound that carries further in the night than you expect. "All right," Evelyn said. "Then I'll start at the beginning." And she did. She talked for 2 hours. By the time she finished, the lamp had burned low and the whiskey bottle was considerably lighter, and Jace Holloway understood for the first time exactly what he'd walked into when he signed his name that morning in a church full of people who'd come to watch him fail. The ranch was the least of it. The territory had a cancer in it that had been growing for 15 years, fed by money and silence and the particular kind of fear that keeps good people from saying what they know. Evelyn, Nora, had spent 3 years carrying the evidence of that cancer in a locked room at the end of a hall, waiting for a moment when she might be able to use it without dying in the process. He looked at her across the kitchen table. She was watching him with that still, careful expression he'd come to recognize, waiting to see what he would do with what she'd told him. "Why didn't you go to federal authorities?" he asked. "I tried. 2 years ago. The letter I sent was intercepted." She said it simply, without self-pity. "The man I sent it through was found dead on the road to Denver 3 days later." She paused. "I have not tried a second time yet. The timing has to be right. The right moment, the right person, the right route. If I move too early or too carelessly, the evidence disappears and so do I. And you thought getting married gave me more time to wait for that moment." She looked at her hands. "I know how it sounds." It sounded calculated, was what it sounded like. It sounded like he had walked into a situation considerably more complicated than the one he'd believed himself to be in a church full of people watching him this morning. But Jace Holloway had been raised on a ranch by a man who believed that you dealt with the situation in front of you, not the one you'd hoped for. He put his empty glass down on the table. "Those men will come back with more numbers," he said. "We need to know how much time we have and who we can trust." He paused. "Is there anyone? Anywhere between here and wherever those federal marshals need to be?" She looked at him. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it apparently wasn't that. "There might be," she said carefully. "A man named Reeves, a deputy out of the Caldwell office. He's not owned. I can't be certain, but I believe he's not owned." "How far is Caldwell?" 2 days' ride." He nodded slowly. "Then we start there." "Jace," her voice was quiet, "you understand what I'm asking you to walk into?" "You didn't ask," he said. "I'm choosing." She held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in those gray-green eyes. Not softness exactly, but something that hadn't been there before. He couldn't name it. "Get some sleep," he said, and pushed back his chair. "Both of us should. Tomorrow we figure out what we actually have and what we need." He walked upstairs to his room and took off his boots and his father's jacket and lay down on top of the blanket in the dark. His mind wouldn't settle. It turned over everything she'd told him. The names, the numbers, the shape of a corruption too large to have an easy edge. He thought about the men on horseback and the way they'd looked riding in, like men who were used to getting what they came for. He thought about the way she'd stood in that doorway and told them she'd shoot without moving a single muscle in her face. He thought about Croft's smile in the church pew that morning. A satisfied smile, full of the pleasure of a man who'd arranged something. But Croft was small compared to what Evelyn had just described. A regional opportunist, not an architect. He'd been a player in someone else's game without knowing it, probably. A lot of people, apparently, were players in someone else's game without knowing it. Jace stared at the ceiling in the dark. He'd walked in that morning believing the worst thing that could happen was a loveless marriage and a quiet, diminished life. He'd believed that by the end of that day because it was the worst thing he'd been able to imagine. He had not been imagining big enough. Outside, the owl was still calling somewhere in the dark. He lay there and listened to it, until finally his thoughts went quiet and he slept. Down the hall, in the room with the locked door, Evelyn sat at a small desk in the lamplight with the papers she'd been protecting for 3 years spread in front of her. She'd been carrying this alone for a long time. She knew what that had cost her. The constant vigilance, the isolation, the careful construction of a life that would hold just long enough. She knew what loneliness felt like when you wore it every day for months and then years. She thought about the young man sitting across the kitchen table from her, tracing the scratch in the wood with one finger. She thought about the way he'd listened, not impatiently, not with the look men sometimes got when they were waiting for a woman to finish talking. He'd listened the way someone listens when they actually want to understand something. She thought about what he'd said. "You didn't ask. I'm choosing." She folded the papers carefully and put them back in the locked box and put the box back where it belonged. She turned off the lamp and sat for a moment in the darkness. She had not planned for someone who would choose. She had planned for someone who could be managed, someone who would stay out of her way and give her the legal protection she needed and be handled at a careful distance. She had been very precise in her requirements. The arrangement was supposed to be clean and controllable. Nothing about tonight had gone the way she'd calculated. She sat in the dark for a while longer, listening to the sounds the house made at night, the settling of the walls, the wind brushing across the roof. Then she went to bed. Outside, the owl had gone quiet somewhere in the dark distance, and the territory stretched away under an enormous sky full of stars, indifferent and ageless, the same sky that had watched 1,000 arrangements between strangers in hard circumstances and would watch 1,000 more. This one was not finished, not even close. He was up before dawn, not because he'd slept well, he hadn't, but because lying in the dark turning things over was starting to feel worse than moving. Jace pulled on his boots in the gray pre-light and went downstairs and built up the fire in the kitchen stove. And by the time the water was boiling, he'd already worked through the rough shape of what the next few days needed to look like. The problem was information. Specifically, the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know. He knew there were 5 men who'd ridden in last night and would come back with more. He knew there was a box of evidence in a locked room that was apparently dangerous enough to get people killed. He knew there was a man named Vincent Blackthorne somewhere at the center of it all, with money and reach and 15 years of practice making problems disappear. And he knew there was a deputy in Caldwell 2 days right away who might or might not be the kind of man who stayed bought. What he didn't know was the timeline. How long before those men came back? Whether Blackthorne already knew where Evelyn was, or whether last night's riders had been operating on a lead that might still be soft. He didn't know how many people between here and Caldwell were on someone's payroll. He didn't know how much the evidence in that locked room was actually worth once it got into the right hands, or how many people had already tried to get it there and failed. He poured the coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited. She came down 20 minutes later, dressed and composed, her hair already pinned back. She didn't look like a woman who'd spent the night turning over what she'd confessed across this same table. She looked like she'd slept 8 hours and made a plan. He was starting to understand that this was simply how she moved through the world. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him without ceremony. She looked at his face and then at the window where the sky was going pale at the horizon. "You've been up a while," she said, thinking. "About?" "The timeline." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Those men last night. Do they know for certain you're here, or were they working a lead?" She considered this seriously. "A lead, I believe. The man who spoke to me, his name is Russ Deller. He's worked for Connell for years. He was watching my face when he said my name, testing the reaction." She paused. "If they knew for certain, they wouldn't have come with 5. They would have come with 20. So we have some time. Some. Deller is not stupid. He'll report back to Connell, and Connell will report to Blackthorne, and Blackthorne will send more resources. Whether that takes 3 days or 10 days depends on how quickly they move." She drank her coffee. "In my experience, they move faster than you expect." "Then Caldwell is the first thing." "It's the most important thing." She set her cup down. "Deputy Reeves, I need to explain why I believe he's trustworthy, because it's not something I can fully verify. I sent a letter through a different channel 18 months ago, not to him directly, but to his office through someone I believed was secure. The letter was coded. If it had been intercepted and decoded, certain things would have happened that didn't happen. Reeves sent a reply through the same channel that indicated he understood what I was saying. But Jace absorbed this. You've been building toward Caldwell for a year and a half. I've been building toward it carefully. Moving too fast gets people killed. Something flickered in her expression, just briefly. I already know that. He thought about what she'd said last night. The letter. The man found dead on the road to Denver. Who was he asked. The man you sent the first letter through. She was quiet for a moment. His name was Thomas Ridley. He was a courier. He had a wife in Denver and 2 daughters. She said it without visible emotion, but the flatness itself was a kind of weight. I have thought about him every day for 2 years. Jace didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. Reeves is different, she continued after a moment. He's a federal deputy, not a civilian. He has his own protection, his own chain of command. Getting him the evidence is not the same as getting a letter to him. If I send him the full documentation through the right channel, he has the authority to act on it without exposing himself the way Ridley was exposed. She folded her hands on the table. But I need to reach him directly, in person, ideally, or through someone who can vouch that the meeting is genuine. You can't ride to Caldwell yourself. No. She said it simply, without argument. Deller may be watching the roads already. A woman traveling alone would be remarked upon. He understood what she was saying before she finished saying it. But a man on ranch business wouldn't be. A man who'd just married would have reasons to be riding to town for various practical matters. Nobody would look twice. He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him steadily. And he noticed, not for the first time, that she never looked away first. Most people, when they were asking something difficult, had a way of softening their eyes or finding something else to look at. She didn't. If I ride to Caldwell, he said, you're alone here. I've been alone here for 2 years. Not with Deller knowing the property. A brief pause. I have a rifle, and I know how to use it. I also have the cellar. She said it practically, the way you talk about available tools. The house is not indefensible. He thought about this, about leaving her here, 4 miles from town, with men who knew the road back. He thought about the alternative, which was both of them riding to Caldwell and leaving the evidence unattended, or taking it with them and risking it on the road. I'll ride tomorrow morning, he said, early, before the light. He paused. I want you to write down everything I need to say to Reeves. The verification, whatever code or signal he'll recognize, everything. And I want to know what the evidence actually is, not the shape of it, the specifics. She nodded slowly. That's fair. One more thing. He met her eyes. Is there anyone in Harlan who might tell Deller something useful? Someone who'd notice I'd ridden out? She thought about this carefully. Harlan Croft, she said. He watches everything that moves through this county. Whether he'd go out of his way to give Deller information, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't assume he wouldn't. Croft's connected to Blackthorn. I don't know the nature of their arrangement, but Croft has been operating in this territory without significant opposition for a long time. That doesn't happen without being aligned with the right people. Jace thought about the smile in the second pew, the satisfied look of a man closing a deal. Yeah, that tracked. All right, he said. He pushed back his chair. I'm going to ride into Harlan this morning, not Caldwell. I need supplies and it'll look normal. While I'm there, I'll get a feel for whether Deller or any of his people have been asking questions. He stood up. While I'm gone, keep the doors latched and don't go far from the house. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're being careful. I'm being practical. Most men in your position, she said, would have left before sunrise. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. Most men in my position didn't know what they were in for when they signed up. He put the hat on. Neither did you, for that matter. He went out to saddle the roan. Harlan in the morning had the specific quality of a place still deciding what kind of day it was going to be. The main street was quiet at that hour, the storefronts still shuttered, only the feed merchant and the bakery showing any sign of life. Jace tied the roan in front of Alderman's general store and went in for the things he needed: flour, lamp oil, a new coil of rope, and he paid attention while he was doing it. Alderman himself was a heavy-set man with a careful disposition who had always been decent to the Holloways. While he was tallying the order, Jace asked in a conversational way whether there'd been any strangers through in the past day or two. Alderman's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. "Few men came through yesterday evening," he said. "Stopped at the Criterion for a drink. Didn't say much about who they were or where they were going." "Rough-looking? Working men." Alderman finished tallying and looked up. "Didn't cause any trouble. Asked after the Voss place, whether anyone knew it." He looked at Jace with a complicated expression. "I told them I didn't know the property particularly." "Appreciate that," Jace said. "You know who they are?" "Working on figuring that out." Alderman folded the receipt and pushed it across the counter. "Your father was a decent man, Jace. Didn't deserve what happened to him." He said it without embellishment, just matter of fact. "I hope you're being careful." "Trying to be." He loaded the supplies on the roan and rode back out of town the same direction he'd come in, and he didn't look back. But he filed everything Alderman had told him into the careful inventory he was building in his head. Deller had asked about the property by name, which meant he wasn't certain, but he was close. The lead was getting harder, not softer. They had less time than he'd hoped. He told Evelyn what he'd learned when he got back. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the yard for a long moment. "I need to show you something," she said. She went upstairs, and he heard the sound of the lock at the end of the hall, and then she came back down with a flat wooden box, the kind used for storing documents. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were papers, many papers, arranged in a careful order, each one handled so many times that the edges had gone soft. She spread them out with a methodical care that suggested she knew exactly where each one belonged. "These are copies," she said. "Copies I made of Connell's financial records over 2 years. These," she pointed to a set of documents in the upper left, "are records of government contracts. Specifically, railroad contracts awarded by federal land agents in Wyoming Territory between 1871 and 1876. The contracts on the surface are legitimate. What's underneath them isn't." He looked at the documents. They were dense with figures and names, agents, contractors, amounts. The contracts were awarded to Blackthorn's companies, she continued, but the work specified in the contracts was never fully completed. In several cases, it was barely started. The payments were made regardless. She moved her finger to another set of papers. "These are the payment records. You can see the discrepancy. Here is what was contracted. Here is what was paid. Here is what the actual cost of the completed work would have been. The difference, in total, is approximately $400,000. Jace stared at the number. "Over 5 years," she said, $400,000 of federal money was paid to Blackthorn's companies for work that wasn't done. Some of it went back to the land agents who approved the contracts." She pointed to another page. "Those payments are here. The agents' names, the amounts, the dates. And these are copies you made yourself, in my own hand from the originals, which means they're not admissible in a court without corroboration. I know that. But they're enough to open an investigation. They're enough for a federal deputy to get a warrant and compel access to the originals, which still exist because Connell is too careful to destroy records he thinks no one knows about." She moved to a third set of documents. Her expression had shifted slightly, not softer, but more careful, the way a person's face changes when they get to the part of the story that costs them something. "These are different," she said. He looked. These were not financial records. They were letters. Personal correspondence, some of it, and what appeared to be internal reports. "There were 3 witnesses," she said. 3 men who worked for Connell in different capacities who had direct knowledge of the fraud. All 3 died within 18 months of each other, between 1874 and 1876. The official causes of death were various. A riding accident, a drowning, a fight outside a saloon. She put her finger on one of the letters. "This is a letter from Connell to a man named Jarvis, who I believe worked directly for Blackthorn. It references the need to address the Garfield matter. Garfield was one of the 3 witnesses. This letter was written 11 days before Garfield drowned." She paused. "I cannot prove causation from a letter that uses euphemism, but a federal investigator could." The kitchen was very quiet. Jace looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at the careful handwriting. Her handwriting, copied out page by page in whatever circumstances she'd managed to find, carrying this from wherever she'd started and through 2 years of hiding. "How did you get these out?" he asked, without Connell knowing. "Slowly," she said, "over months. He trusted me with the records because I was good at keeping them and because I was a woman, which meant he didn't think I was a threat." Her voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. He was wrong about that. "And the originals? You said they still exist." "As far as I know, Connell doesn't destroy records because records are leverage, and he's always thinking about leverage. The originals are almost certainly in his operation in Cheyenne." She began gathering the papers back into their careful order. "The point is that what I have is enough to start the process, enough to make a credible case to a federal deputy that there is something worth investigating." She looked at him. "Which is what I need Reeves to hear." He nodded slowly. He watched her hands as she organized the papers, quick and precise, the movements of someone who'd done this many times, arranged and rearranged this evidence, sat with it in the dark and thought about what it meant and what it cost and whether it was ever going to be enough. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "You've been carrying this for 3 years, alone." "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. "That's a long time." She looked at him with those careful eyes, and something in her expression shifted in a way he'd started to learn to watch for. Small. Barely there. Like light on water. "It's long enough," she said. Then she closed the box and latched it. He rode for Caldwell before dawn the next morning. The road was empty in the gray pre-light, and the roan moved well, and he kept off the main track for the first few miles just in case someone was watching the road out of Harlan. The land out here was open, rolling grass and scattered juniper, the mountains a dark line against the pale sky to the west. And a rider was visible from a long way off, which cut both ways. He could see anyone coming. Anyone coming could see him. He made good time through the morning. The sun came up behind him and lit the grass gold, and then settled into the flat white light of a working day. He stopped once to water the roan at a creek crossing and eat the biscuits he'd brought, and then he kept moving. He thought about what she'd told him, about Blackthorne and Connell and the $400,000 and the 3 men who'd died. He thought about the letter referencing the Garfield matter 11 days before a man drowned. He thought about the shape of a system, how it would have to work, the money moving through legitimate channels on top, while underneath a different kind of accounting was being kept. He thought about how many people would have to be part of something like that, knowingly or not. How many hands the money touched before it disappeared. He thought about Harlan Croft in that second pew, and the silver watch chain. The more he thought, the less comfortable he was. He reached Caldwell late in the second afternoon, coming in from the north along a creek road that let him arrive without riding through the center of town. Caldwell was bigger than Harlan, a proper settlement with a rail spur and a row of commercial buildings along the main street and the feel of a place that had decided to stay. The federal deputy's office was easy to find, a low building near the end of the street with a government seal painted on the door. Jace sat on the roan across the street for a few minutes and watched the building. Nothing about it suggested anything particular. Then he dismounted, tied up, and went in. The man at the desk looked up. He was maybe 45, lean with a weathered face and a deputy's star on his coat. He had the particular quality of stillness that some experienced lawmen develop. Not relaxed exactly, but settled. Like a man who had learned to be patient because patience was the thing that kept you alive. "Help you?" he said. "Looking for Deputy Reeves." "You found him." Jace took off his hat. "My name is Jace Holloway. I'm writing on behalf of my wife." He paused. He said the phrase she had given him, the coded phrase from the letter 18 months ago, the one she'd said Reeves would recognize. "She sends her regards from the cold river." Something changed in Reeves's face. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small tightening, a refocusing, the look of a man who has been waiting for something and has just heard it coming. He looked at Jace for a moment, then he stood up and went to the door and looked out at the street in both directions. Then he came back and closed the door and drew the curtain across the window. "Sit down," he said. Jace sat. "She's alive," Reeves said. It wasn't quite a question. "She's alive. She's at the property outside Harlan. Men came looking for her 3 nights ago. 5 riders, asking for her by her old name. She thinks they'll be back with more. Reeves sat down slowly. He put his hands flat on the desk, and Jace could see him thinking, not panicking, not performing, just working through it methodically. How much time does she think she has? Days, maybe less. And the documentation? She has it, copies of everything. The contract records, the payment discrepancies, the correspondence about the witnesses. Jace watched the deputy's face. She said it's enough to open an investigation and compel access to the originals. Reeves looked at him steadily. What's your involvement in this, Mr. Holloway? She's my wife. That's a legal fact, not an explanation. I know what I married into, Jace said. I'm here because those are the facts in front of me, and I'd rather deal with facts than pretend they're not there. Reeves was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man recalibrating something. Then he said, There's a federal circuit judge in Laramie who is clean. I can get word to him through a channel that Blackthorn's people haven't penetrated, as far as I know. If she can get me the documentation, I can get it to the judge with an affidavit and a formal request for a warrant within the week. She needs to know it won't disappear the way the first letter did. Reeves's jaw tightened slightly. I know about Ridley. I found out about him 6 months after the fact, and there was nothing I could do about it by then. He paused. This is why I need the documentation in my hands, not in a letter. Physical evidence transferred directly. Once the judge has it, Blackthorn can't make it disappear without making himself more visible than he wants to be. Jace looked at him. He was making the same calculations he'd been making all day. How much to trust? How far? On what basis? He had no way to verify this man beyond the code phrase and the way he'd drawn the curtain and the steadiness behind his eyes. Sometimes you made decisions on incomplete information. That was just what decisions were. She'll need safe passage to get to you, he said, or a way for you to come to the property without drawing attention. I can come to Harlan on routine business. I do it 3-4 times a year. No one looks twice at a federal deputy traveling the county roads. He thought for a moment. 4 days. Tell her 4 days. She needs to have everything ready. 4 days, Jace said. He stood up and put his hat back on. There's one more thing. A name she mentioned, Harlan Croft, runs land operations in the county. She thinks he might be aligned with Blackthorn, but she's not certain. Reeves's expression shifted. Croft, he said. He said the name the way you say a name you already know. That's useful to know, Mr. Holloway. Thank you. He paused. Tell her to stay off the roads. I'll tell her. He rode back through the evening, and the stars came out one by one over the open land, and the roan kept a good steady pace under him. And he thought about 4 days and what 4 days looked like when you were waiting for men who moved faster than you expected. He got back to the property in the deep middle of the night. He came in quiet, the way he'd left, and he was halfway to the stable when the front door opened and Evelyn stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other. She lowered the rifle when she saw who it was. He led the roan in and unsaddled her and rubbed her down, and when he came out, Evelyn was waiting on the porch. She had put the rifle inside, but she still had the lamp, and the light made her face hard to read. Reeves, she said. He knows he's coming in 4 days. He wants the full documentation ready to transfer. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. He said he has a clean judge in Laramie. She exhaled, but not dramatically, just a slow release of breath, like something she'd been holding tightened its way loose. She looked at the lamp flame for a moment. 4 days, she said. He says it's enough time. And you believe him? Jace thought about the curtain drawn across the window and the way Reeves had said Ridley's name. I believe him, he said. Not because I'm certain, because it's the best option we have and standing still is worse than moving. She was quiet for a moment. The night was clear and cold, the way fall nights got out here when the season finally committed to itself. The lamp made a small, warm circle in all that darkness. Deller came back, she said. Jace went still. When? This afternoon, just him and one other man. They rode the perimeter of the property. I could see them from the upstairs window. They didn't approach the house. She paused. They were looking. Counting the outbuildings, I think, learning the layout. He looked out at the dark yard, measured it in his mind. The fence lines, the approach roads, the sight lines from the stable. They're planning, he said. Yes. She said it calmly, the way she said most things, but her hand on the lamp was tight. "They're not here to scare me off. They never were. They're here to end it." He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her for a moment. From up here you could see further into the dark. The fence line, the road, the black shapes of the juniper scrub against the slightly lighter sky. 4 days, he said again. 4 days, she agreed. They stood there in the cold for a moment longer, two people in a small circle of lamplight with the dark pressing in from every direction, and then she went inside and he followed and she latched the door behind them. The house settled around them in the quiet. He sat down at the kitchen table and she poured coffee without asking and sat across from him. And they talked until well past midnight about the layout of the property and who could be watched, about Croft and what his involvement might mean, about the documents and how to prepare them for transfer. They talked like two people who had stopped pretending they were strangers, which was what they'd become without either of them marking the exact moment it happened. Outside, somewhere on the road that came in from the north, a horse moved in the darkness. Neither of them heard it, but it was there. 4 days was starting to look like a very long time. The first 2 days passed in a controlled tension that was almost worse than open conflict. Jay set a routine deliberately, not because routine felt natural under the circumstances, but because routine looked normal from the outside, and normal was the thing they needed to project. He worked the property each morning the way he'd been working it since he arrived. Fixed the section of fence along the east line, cleared debris from the drainage channel behind the stable, split wood until the pile was high enough to look like a man planning to stay through winter. He moved through the yard in plain sight, unhurried, the way a man moves when he's done nothing to be ashamed of and has nowhere urgent to be. Evelyn kept to the house. She was preparing the documents, organizing the copies into a presentable order, writing out a summary of what each set of records demonstrated, adding her own notes in the margins to guide whoever was going to read them for the first time. He could see her through the kitchen window sometimes when he came in close to the house, bent over the table, her pen moving steadily across the page. She was also, he noticed, always aware of where the rifle was. They'd positioned it just inside the kitchen door, loaded, within easy reach of the table where she worked. He had his own pistol on him during the day. They hadn't discussed it as a plan exactly. It was more like two people who were paying attention to the same situation and making the same adjustments independently. On the second afternoon, he climbed to the roof of the stable under the pretense of checking the shingles along the south pitch, and from up there he had a clear view of the surrounding land in every direction. He stayed up there longer than the shingles required. To the north, maybe 3/4 of a mile out, he could see a rider sitting still on a rise, not moving, just watching the property. He came down and went inside. "One man on the north rise," he told Evelyn, "has been there the better part of an hour." She didn't look up from the papers immediately. Then she set her pen down and looked at him. Watching. Watching. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter. "They're not moving yet. They're waiting for something." "Waiting for Blackthorn's authorization," she said. "Deller operates through Connell, and Connell wouldn't move on this without Blackthorn knowing. Blackthorn will want to know what they found before he decides how to respond." She paused. "Which means Blackthorn doesn't know exactly what I have. He suspects. He's been suspecting for 3 years. Does that help us? It means he's sending men to confirm before he acts, which means there is still a layer between where we are and the worst version of this." She picked her pen up again. "But that layer is not thick." He went back outside. The rider on the north rise was still there. On the third day, Harlan Croft came to call. He arrived in the early afternoon in a good buggy with a hired driver, dressed the way he always dressed, the dark coat, the silver chain, and he came up the front path with the confident walk of a man who believes his presence is always welcome. Jay saw him coming from the yard and went to meet him at the gate. "Holloway." Croft stopped and looked at him with an expression of careful friendliness. "I heard you'd settled in out here. Thought I'd come by and extend my congratulations in person." "That's kind of you," Jay said. He kept his voice easy. He kept his hands loose at his sides. "Marriage is a serious business." Croft smiled. "Your father would have been glad to see you settled. My father would have had opinions about a lot of things." A small pause. Croft looked past Jace toward the house. "Is Mrs. Holloway about? I'd like to offer my congratulations to her as well." "She's not feeling well today. I'll pass it along." Croft's eyes came back to him. Nothing serious, I hope. Just tired. Jace held his gaze. She's been busy. Another pause, longer this time. Croft had a way of making silences work for him, filling them with an implication of patience, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing to hide. Jace had seen it in the bank, in the land office, in the various rooms where Croft had sat across tables from people who owed him money. I understand she's a private woman, Croft said. Edgar Voss always said so. He said it pleasantly, informatively, like a man sharing useful background. She is, Jace agreed. Keeps to herself. Doesn't mix much. Croft looked out at the property with the assessing eye of a man who values things by what they'd fetch. Good piece of land here. Edgar kept it well. A pause. You planning to run cattle on it, or keep to the original operation? Still working that out. Of course. Of course. Croft smiled again. No rush. You've got time to find your footing. He adjusted his coat, a small preparatory gesture. I did want to mention, and this is purely as a neighbor, you understand, there's been some talk. Men passing through, asking questions about the property. You may have heard. I may have. I wouldn't want you to be caught off guard by anything unpleasant. If there's anything I can do to help facilitate, any questions about the land title, any legal matters that need clearing up, my office is always available. Jace looked at him, at the silver chain, at the careful, generous smile. I appreciate that, he said. We're fine. Of course you are. Croft touched the brim of his hat. Give my regards to your wife, and congratulations again, son. Truly. He walked back to the buggy, and his driver turned them around, and they went back up the road to Harlan. Jace watched the buggy until it was out of sight. Then he went inside. Evelyn was standing just inside the front window. She'd heard. He's counting days, she said. Yeah. Jace sat down. He knows something's happening. He wanted to see my face. What did he see? Nothing useful, I hope. He looked at her. He mentioned the land title, legal matters needing clearing up. She was quiet for a moment, then, he's positioning himself. If things go wrong for us, if Blackthorn moves and the evidence disappears and nothing comes of it, Croft wants to be in position to absorb this property. She said it without particular heat, just analytical. He's been waiting to expand east for years. Edgar wouldn't sell. And you wouldn't sell. And I wouldn't sell. She turned from the window. One more day, she said. Reeves comes tomorrow. One more day, he agreed. Papam isaka tis. Reeves did not come the next day. He came that night, which was either a sign of caution or a sign of urgency, and Jace couldn't immediately tell which. The knock on the back door came after 10, 3 quick and 2 slow, the pattern they'd agreed on. Jace had the pistol in his hand when he opened it. Reeves came in fast and quiet, alone, and he looked like a man who'd been riding hard. His coat was road-dusted, and there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there in Caldwell. Sit down, Jace said. Reeves sat. He took off his hat and set it on the table and looked at Evelyn, who was already there with the document box in front of her. Something changed, she said. It wasn't a question. Blackthorn is here, Reeves said. He arrived in Caldwell 2 days ago. I found out yesterday morning. He's not traveling under his own name, but it's him. He's got 6 men with him at least, and he's been meeting with county officials. He paused. He knows you're in the territory. I don't know how much beyond that he knows, but he moved fast, which means somebody told him something that made him move. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. Croft, she said, without inflection. Possibly. I can't confirm it. Reeves looked at the document box. Is that it? Everything I have. He reached into his coat and produced a leather dispatch case worn at the corners. I need you to tell me specifically what's in there, what a federal judge would need to know before he issued a warrant. So she told him. She went through it methodically, the same way she'd gone through it with Jace at this same table. The contracts, the payment records, the correspondence about the witnesses. Reeves listened with the focused attention of a man doing professional triage, occasionally stopping her to ask a clarifying question that was always precise and always pointed at exactly the right thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The letter referencing the Garfield matter, he said. You have the original of that? A copy in my hand. I made it from the original. And your attestation that you personally copied it from the original document? I can write one tonight. Do that. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you something directly. Can you testify to this in front of a federal court? To everything you've just told me, under oath? The kitchen was very still. Jace looked at Evelyn. She was looking at Reeves, and her expression had the particular quality it got when she was making a decision she'd already thought through to its furthest edge. Yes, she said. I can. Reeves nodded. He didn't say anything congratulatory about it or perform any admiration. He just nodded and reached for the dispatch case. Then here's what we do. Tonight you give me duplicates of the most critical documents, the payment discrepancy records and the Garfield correspondence. I ride out before dawn with those in the case. I have a contact in the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, who I trust. Not Laramie. Cheyenne is closer and cleaner right now. He gets the documents, he gets your written attestation, and he files for the warrant. Chunim Bashmati. And the originals? Jay said. What she has here? She keeps them here until the warrant is issued. We need the originals intact as evidence. We can't have them in transit twice. He looked at Jace. Which means this property needs to stay secure for as long as it takes to get that warrant through. How long? 3 days minimum, possibly 5. The judge I'm using has authority to act quickly if the case is credible. He paused. I believe this case is credible. The three of them sat with that for a moment. 3 to 5 days with Blackthorn in the territory, and Deller watching the north rise, and Croft making friendly visits. There's another problem, Jace said. He looked at Reeves. If Blackthorn came here personally, he's not planning to wait for someone else to handle this. No, Reeves agreed. He's not. So he's going to move before you can get that warrant through. That's what I'm concerned about. Reeves picked up his hat. I won't pretend otherwise. Jace looked at the document box. He looked at Evelyn, who was looking at the same box with an expression that was difficult to name. Not fear, but something close to the territory that borders it, the place where a person has finally stopped running and is standing still and waiting for what they've been running from to arrive. She had been carrying this for 3 years. 3 years of calculating and waiting and moving carefully, and now the careful time was over and whatever came next was going to come fast. All right, Jay said. He stood up. What do you need from us tonight? They worked until 2 in the morning. Evelyn copied the critical documents in her clear, steady hand while Reeves and Jace worked out sightlines and approaches and what could reasonably be defended and what couldn't. They talked about who in Harlan might be reliable in a crisis and who might not. They talked about the cellar and how long 2 people could hold a position in a house against determined men from outside. None of it was comforting, exactly, but it was practical, and practical was what they had. When Reeves left in the early hours, the dispatch case under his coat, he paused at the back door and looked at them both. I'll send word the moment the warrant is filed, he said. Whatever happens out here, don't let those documents be taken. If it comes to it, get them to me any way you can. Then he was gone, back into the dark. Blackthorn came on the 5th day. He didn't come the way Deller had come the first night, riding in fast with men visible and weapons out. He came in the late afternoon in a closed carriage, proper and unhurried, with 4 riders flanking it at a respectful distance. The carriage stopped at the front gate, and a man Jace didn't recognize climbed down and walked to the door and knocked politely. Jace answered it. He kept the door close to his body. Mr. Holloway. The man was 50-ish, well-dressed, with a contained, deliberate manner. My name is Vincent Blackthorn. I wonder if I might speak with your wife. The name landed the way she'd said it would. Not loud, but with weight. Jace looked at the man. He looked ordinary in the way that powerful men sometimes look ordinary up close, the danger of them in the patience behind the eyes rather than anything you could point to. About what? Jace said. I believe there may have been some misunderstanding between my organization and Mrs. Holloway going back several years. I'm hoping we can resolve it simply and without any further unpleasantness. He said it the way a man says something he's practiced. Smooth, reasonable, containing nothing you could call an overt threat, while implying every one of them. My wife is not receiving visitors. I understand, but I've come a considerable distance, and the matter is somewhat time-sensitive. He paused. I assure you, Mr. Holloway, this is a conversation, nothing more. I simply want to speak with her. From somewhere behind Jace, Evelyn said, "Let him in." He turned. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway. She'd heard everything. Her face was composed, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was making calculations faster than other people could track. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and she gave him the smallest, most deliberate nod. He stepped back and opened the door. Blackthorn came in alone. He left the 4 riders at the gate, which was either a gesture of good faith or a performance of it. Jace closed the door behind him and stayed near it. The 3 of them stood in the front room. Blackthorn looked around the room. Not obviously, not rudely, just a quick inventory of a man who takes stock of every space he enters. His eyes went to the document box on the kitchen table and came back to Evelyn without lingering. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Or perhaps I should say, Miss Callahan." "Either name is fine," Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I'll be direct with you. You have documentation that belongs to my business interests. Copies, I understand, made without authorization during your employment with a contracting firm in Cheyenne." He paused. "I'd like them returned. They weren't yours to begin with." "That's a characterization I'd dispute." He said it without heat. "What those documents represent are private business records that were taken without permission. Their disposition has been a source of concern to my organization for some time." "I imagine it has." She moved into the kitchen and stood behind the table, not exactly between Blackthorn and the document box, but close to it. "I've wondered sometimes how it felt, knowing they existed and not knowing where they were." Something shifted in Blackthorn's expression, just barely, just a tightening at the edge. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has underestimated. "I want to make you an offer, Mrs. Holloway. A fair one. You return what you took, you sign a statement indicating that any copies you may have made are accounted for, and in exchange I ensure that certain complications involving your past, your real past, are quietly resolved. You could live here without difficulty, without men watching the road. And the $400,000 your companies collected for work that wasn't done?" A beat of silence. "That," Blackthorn said carefully, "is a complex accounting matter that has no bearing on the 3 men who died," Evelyn said. "Garfield, Walsh, Tremaine. Was that a complex accounting matter too?" The room went very still. Outside, Jace could hear the horses at the gate shifting. The late afternoon light was going amber through the windows. Blackthorn looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, the reasonable tone was still there, but something underneath it had changed. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm trying to resolve this without anyone else getting hurt. Give me the documents." "I won't," she said, "and I'll tell you why." She put her hands flat on the table, the same gesture Jace had seen her make when she was about to say something she'd thought through to the end. "Because those documents are not in this box anymore. The most critical records, the payment discrepancies, the Garfield correspondence, were transferred to a federal deputy 4 days ago. They are currently in the hands of the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, with my written attestation and a formal request for a warrant." She paused. "Killing me doesn't make them disappear. Burning this house doesn't make them disappear. The only thing you can do now that would make any difference at all is run, and even that won't work for long." He gasped some nuts. Blackthorn went very still. Jace watched him. He watched the calculation happening behind those contained eyes. The rapid rearrangement of a man who had arrived here believing he held all the significant cards and was now being shown that the deck had been reshuffled while he wasn't looking. "You're lying," Blackthorn said. "I'm not," Evelyn said. "I've been waiting 3 years for the timing to be right. Deputy Reeves of the Caldwell office was here 5 days ago. You can verify his travel records if you like." She held Blackthorn's gaze. "It's done, Mr. Blackthorn. The question in front of you now isn't whether this comes out. It's whether you make it worse before it does." Another silence. Longer this time. "Those records," Blackthorn said, with the soft, careful tone of a man trying to find a new angle, "were prepared by a woman with a false identity who ran from her employer and has been living under an assumed name. Her credibility as a witness, her credibility as a witness is established by the records themselves," Evelyn said. "I kept those books for 2 years. I know every entry in them. No one needs to take my word for the numbers. The numbers speak for themselves." She paused. "And you know that. That's why you've been looking for me for 3 years instead of simply denying everything." Blackthorne set his hat on the chair beside him. He sat down slowly, which was not what Jace had been expecting. He sat the way a man sits when he's decided that standing is no longer the position of strength he thought it was. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had shifted, not to weakness exactly, but to a different register, negotiating register. "I don't want anything from you," Evelyn said. "That's not how this works. What happens next is not a negotiation between you and me. What happens next is a federal process. Federal processes can be influenced. I know. I've watched you influence them for years." She leaned forward slightly. "But you're not invisible anymore. The moment those documents landed in Cheyenne, your name was attached to a formal federal inquiry. Every judge you own, every sheriff on your payroll. Using them now doesn't make your problems go away. It just adds obstruction of a federal investigation to everything else." She met his eyes. "You know how this works better than I do." Blackthorne looked at her for a long time. Outside, one of the horses at the gate whinnied. Then one of the rider's voices too low to make out the words, and then a sound that Jace had been dreading since the afternoon started. The sound of more horses arriving. Multiple horses, coming in from both ends of the road. Jace moved to the window and looked out. There were 8 men at the gate now, where there had been 4. Deller was among them, visible by the set of his shoulders. They were all armed, and they were positioned with a deliberateness that wasn't casual. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the window too. Blackthorne hadn't moved from his chair. He was looking at the table. His hands were very still. "Call them off," Jace said. Blackthorne looked up at him. "I didn't call them here." "Someone did." Jace looked at him steadily. "Call them off anyway." Something moved across Blackthorne's face, something complicated, the look of a man who has set a machine in motion and is discovering that machines don't always respond to second thoughts. He stood up slowly and went to the front window and looked out at his men. Deller was watching the house. When he saw Blackthorne at the window, he tilted his head slightly, a waiting gesture. Blackthorne raised one hand, palm out, a hold signal. Deller looked at it. He looked at the other men. He looked back at the house. And he lowered his rifle. But he didn't step back from the gate. None of them did. "They'll listen to me for a while," Blackthorne said, coming away from the window. "Not indefinitely." He looked at Evelyn. "You understand what you've done. You understand the position you've put everyone in." "I understand it completely," she said. "I've had 3 years to think about it." Blackthorne's jaw worked slightly. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has spent significant resources trying to eliminate and has just discovered cannot be eliminated. And the look was not admiration exactly. It was closer to the grim acknowledgement of a person who has met the edge of their own power. "The record's in Cheyenne," he said. "If I cooperate with the federal process, that's not a conversation to have with me." Her voice was firm but not triumphant. "That's a conversation to have with Deputy Reeves and the federal court." She picked up the document box and set it to one side of the table. "What I can tell you is that these remaining records, the ones still in this house, don't disappear if you take them. I know what's in them. I wrote them. I can reconstruct them. And I will." She let that sit for a moment. "You cannot unring this bell, Mr. Blackthorne." The room held that sentence for a moment, and then from outside there was a sound. Another voice. Deller's this time, and then a confused shouting, and then the unmistakable sound of more horses coming in hard and fast from the Harlan Road. And this time when Jace moved to the window, his stomach unknotted itself slightly, for the first time all afternoon. 3 riders coming in from the south, moving fast. 2 of them were wearing coats he recognized, federal travel coats, the kind that said something about who was inside them before you were close enough to see a badge. The third was Reeves. They came through the gate before Deller's men could close it, Reeves pulling up short and his horse dancing sideways, and his voice cut through the yard noise like a blade. "Federal deputy, everyone stand where you are. Hands where I can see them." A beat of absolute stillness. Deller looked at his men. His men looked at him. They looked at the 3 riders. They looked at the badges that were visible now, and they made the calculation that armed men make when they suddenly understand the mathematics of their situation have changed. Slowly, hands went up. Jace turned back into the room. Blackthorn was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor, and for the first time he looked something other than controlled. He looked like a man standing in a room where all the exits have just closed simultaneously, aware of it, not yet certain what to do with that awareness. Evelyn was looking at him with those gray-green eyes, steady and unreadable as creek water. "It's over," she said. Not with cruelty, not with satisfaction even, just as a statement of fact. Blackthorn looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his hat, still sitting on the chair where he'd left it when he sat down. He reached over and picked it up and held it in both hands, and he looked older than he had when he walked in. Not broken. Men like Blackthorn didn't break in a moment, but different. The architecture of absolute certainty, which had held his face in that controlled expression for the entire conversation, had developed a crack. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how much this is going to cost you." "I know exactly how much it's going to cost me," Evelyn said. "I've been paying it for 3 years. Outside, Reeves's voice was steady and authoritative, directing men and horses and the suddenly rearranged geography of who was in control of what. Inside the kitchen, the afternoon light lay across the floor in long amber rectangles, and the three of them stood in it, and the world that had existed an hour ago was already gone, replaced by something that hadn't fully taken shape yet. Jace crossed to the back door and opened it. "Deputy Reeves," he called. "Coming." Reeves's boots on the porch steps, and then he was in the doorway, taking in the room, Blackthorn, Evelyn, the document box on the table. His eyes moved quickly and professionally. He looked at Jace. "You all right?" "We're all right." Jace paused. "The warrant came through?" "This afternoon. Laramie and Cheyenne both." He moved into the kitchen and looked at Blackthorn with the expression of a man who has been working toward a moment for a long time and is now standing inside it. "Mr. Blackthorn, I have a federal warrant for your arrest and for the seizure of financial records related to your business operations in Wyoming Territory." He reached into his coat and produced the papers. "I'm going to ask you to come with me quietly." Blackthorn looked at the warrant. He looked at Reeves. He looked one last time at Evelyn. Whatever he was going to say, he thought better of it. He put his hat on. "I'll need to speak with my attorney," he said. "You'll have that opportunity." Reeves stepped aside and gestured toward the door. Blackthorn walked out. Jace stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of hooves in the yard, and voices, and the particular weighted quiet of a situation that has reached its breaking point and broken in the direction that was needed but not guaranteed. Evelyn hadn't moved. She was still standing behind the table, her hands at her sides now, looking at the document box. He could see her chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate breathing that suggested she was holding herself very carefully in the aftermath of something she'd been bracing for a long time. He went and stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did he. Outside, the sounds continued. Reeves and his men organizing their prisoners, Deller's voice going from defiant to resigned in the way voices do when the reality of a situation settles in. "You told him about Reeves before you knew he was coming," Jace said. "Yes. That was a risk. Everything about tonight was a risk," she exhaled. "But a man like Blackthorn needed to know the thing he came here to take was already beyond his reach. If I hadn't told him that, he would have burned the house down just to be certain." Jace thought about this. About the timing. Evelyn talking Blackthorn into a kind of hesitation precisely long enough for Reeves to arrive. He thought about the calculations she'd been running in real time during that conversation, and the steadiness of her voice all the way through it. "How did you know Reeves was coming tonight?" he said. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved, just barely, just enough to be the ghost of something. "I didn't," she said. "I hoped." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the document box, and the kitchen, and the amber light going gray now as the sun finally dropped behind the hills. "Well," he said, "hoping worked." She looked at the window. Outside, Blackthorn's closed carriage was being turned around, now carrying a very different passenger arrangement than it had arrived with. Deller and his men were being sorted by Reeves's 2 deputies, their weapons collected, their futures contracting by the minute. The kitchen smelled like coffee that had gone cold on the stove, and lamp oil, and the faint residue of tension that big moments leave in a room after they pass. "It's not finished," Evelyn said quietly. Courts take time. His attorneys are good. This will take longer than tonight. I know. It could be difficult for a while still. I expect it will be. He went to the stove and touched the coffee pot. Cold. He picked it up and carried it to the counter. You want fresh coffee? She looked at him, that small movement at the corner of her mouth again, more definite this time. Yes, she said. He started building up the fire in the stove. Behind him, she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood, and he could hear her breathing slowly evening out. The careful managed control she'd maintained through the entire afternoon finally releasing its grip, just slightly, into something that was closer to ordinary. Outside, the last of the evening light died on the hills. The yard was still full of people and horses, and the complicated aftermath of what had just happened. But in the kitchen, there was just the sound of the fire catching and the coffee pot on the stove, and two people who had come through something together sitting in the quiet on the other side of it. It wasn't finished. She was right about that. But the worst of it had cracked, and cracks have a way of running all the way through, given enough time and the right kind of pressure. Jace Holloway had lived long enough to believe that, at least. Reeves stayed the night, not in the house. He posted himself on the porch with one of his deputies, a young man named Cord, who didn't talk much and kept his rifle across his knees, with the particular vigilance of someone who understood exactly what the night might still produce. The other deputy rode back toward Harlan, with Blackthorne in the carriage, and Deller and two of his men on horseback ahead of it, wrists bound, the whole procession moving through the dark under a sky full of stars that didn't care about any of it. Jace watched them go from the yard until the sounds faded. Then he went back inside. Evelyn was still at the kitchen table. She had the document box open again and was going through the papers one more time. Not checking them, he thought, just handling them. The way a person handles something they've held so long, it's become part of the texture of their days, and they're not yet sure what their hands will do without it. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything. The fire in the stove had settled to a steady burn, and the kitchen was warm. The coffee he'd made earlier was still hot enough. After a while, she looked up. Cord is young, she said. Reeves seems to trust him. Reeves seems to trust carefully. She looked at the papers in front of her. That's not a criticism. It's the right way to operate. He poured himself coffee and looked at the table. The scratch in the wood that he'd traced with his finger on that first night was still there, diagonal and unrepentant. He'd stopped noticing it sometime in the second week. Now he noticed it again. Blackthorne's attorneys will move fast, he said. Reeves said as much. They'll try to challenge the warrant. They'll argue the evidence was improperly obtained, that I was an employee who stole company records. She closed the box slowly. They're not wrong about the facts. They'll be wrong about the interpretation. Will it hold up? The warrant is based on a formal affidavit. The judge in Laramie issued it after review. He's not going to reverse himself overnight without cause. So, she paused. What they'll try to do is delay. Slow the process down long enough to, I don't know exactly, long enough to find something. Discredit me, discredit the records, find a procedural error. She set her hands on the closed box. But the records from Cheyenne are already in federal hands. The warrant for Blackthorne's business files is already issued. Those things can't be undone. And Connell? Connell is smaller. Once Blackthorne falls, Connell becomes useful to the prosecution as a witness. He'll make that calculation himself. She said it without satisfaction. He's always been better at survival than loyalty. Jace drank his coffee. The night outside was quiet now. Just Cord's occasional movement on the porch, the horses in the stable, the normal sounds of a property settling into the dark. You should sleep, he said. She looked at him steadily. So should you. I will. He paused. Evelyn. He said her name the way he'd started saying it somewhere in the past week, not as a form of address exactly, but as a way of making sure she was tracking him before he said the next thing. Is there anything else? Anything you haven't told me that's going to walk through that door tomorrow? She considered this seriously, which he appreciated. She didn't deflect or reassure. There's Croft, she said. I don't know what Reeves has on him. If Croft was feeding information to Blackthorne, that needs to come out. But that's in Reeves's hands now, not mine. Anything else? The witnesses' families, Garfield, Walsh, Tremaine, they had families. If the federal investigation goes where it should, There may be some accountability there, some recognition. She paused. That matters to me. It's not urgent, but it matters. I understand. She looked at him for a moment longer, that level gray-green look that he'd learned to read as something other than coldness. It was just the way she focused, the same way some people looked sideways when they were thinking. No, she said finally, there's nothing else walking through that door. Good. He stood up and collected the cups. Sleep then. She went upstairs. He rinsed the cups and banked the fire and went out to the porch and talked with Reeves for a while in the dark, low and practical, about the morning's plan and what needed to happen in what order. Reeves was tired but alert, the kind of tired that experience teaches you to work through. You did well today, Reeves told him at one point. Jace thought about what he'd actually done, opened a door, watched a window, poured coffee. She did the work, he said. Reeves looked at him. She did. But she didn't do it alone, which matters more than you might think. He paused. People like her. They get so used to carrying things alone that they forget it's even possible not to. Sometimes what that costs them is the moment when they need to move and they hesitate because they've been alone so long they don't trust the ground under their feet. Jace thought about the kitchen and the way she'd told Blackthorne the documents were already gone and the steadiness of her voice all the way through it. He thought about what it would have taken to produce that steadiness and how different it might have looked if she'd been calculating alone. He didn't say any of that. He just nodded. Get some sleep, Reeves said. Tomorrow is going to be long. He was right. The morning brought two more of Reeves's deputies from Caldwell and a courier from the Territorial Marshal's office who arrived before breakfast with papers that needed signing. And by mid-morning, the Voss property had the feel of a place that had become, briefly and inconveniently, the operational center of something much larger than itself. Jace stayed out of the way of things he didn't need to be in the middle of and helped with the things he could help with, horses, coffee, the particular logistics of keeping a group of people fed and organized in a house that was not large. He rode into Harlan mid-morning for supplies, and this time the town felt different. The news had moved faster than he had. People looked at him in a way that was different from how they'd looked at him on his wedding day, or in the weeks before it, or at any point in this past year. It was a complicated look. Not entirely friendly. Some of it was the wariness that comes with discovering that a situation you thought you understood was more layered than you knew. But underneath the wariness, there was something else, something that felt tentatively like recalculation. He bought what he needed and rode back. Alderman caught him on the way out of the store and said simply, "Heard they took Blackthorne in." "They did." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "Croft?" He said the name carefully. "Reeves is looking into it." Jace tied the last of the supplies to the saddle. "That's all I know." Alderman nodded. He held out his hand and Jace shook it, and the old man held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. "Your father would have been glad," he said. "Not about any of the mess, but about the outcome." Jace rode back to the property. It was late afternoon when things went wrong again. He should have expected it. He'd even said it, that a man like Blackthorne wouldn't go simply, but the shape the trouble took was not the shape he'd been watching for. Reeves had ridden back toward Caldwell that morning with the documents and two of his deputies, leaving Cord and the second deputy, a man named Halsey, at the property. Cord was outside. Halsey was in the front room going through some paperwork of his own. Jace was in the stable. Evelyn was upstairs in the room at the end of the hall, which she'd finally unlocked and left open now that the box it had protected for 3 years was in federal hands. He heard the shot before he understood it. One shot, clean and close, from the direction of the front of the house. He was out of the stable and moving before the echo of it had finished crossing the yard, his hand on his pistol, trying to place the direction, trying to think. Cord was down on the porch. He was alive. Jace could see him moving, one hand pressed to his left arm, trying to get upright. The shot had clipped him. Not fatal, but he was out of the fight for the moment. From inside the house, the sound of Halsey's voice, sharp and commanding, and then another voice, a voice Jace didn't recognize. And then Evelyn's voice, coming from somewhere on the ground floor, which meant she'd come downstairs, which meant... He went through the back door. The kitchen was empty. He moved through it fast to the doorway of the front room and stopped. There were two men he didn't recognize, not Deller's people, different faces, which meant Blackthorne had more layers than Reeves had accounted for. One of them had Halsey at gunpoint in the corner, Halsey's weapon already taken, his hands raised. The other was between Jace and Evelyn, who was standing near the front window, her back straight, her face giving nothing away. The man facing her, 30-ish, hard-faced, not someone improvising this, had his gun leveled, and he was watching her the way a man watches someone he's been specifically sent to deal with. "The box," he said to her. Whatever else she gave the deputy. "Where is it?" "The deputy took everything with him this morning," she said. Her voice was level, but Jace could hear something underneath it that wasn't quite fear. Something tighter than calm. Something working hard to present as calm. "You're lying." "I'm not. It's in federal custody. If you shoot me, it doesn't change that." The man's eyes moved around the room, looking for the box, not finding it. He looked at Jace in the doorway. Jace had his pistol out, but the second man had Halsey, and the geometry of the room was bad. Too many bodies between him and a clean line. "Get in here," the man said to Jace. "Hands where I see them." Jace stepped into the room. He kept his pistol. The man watched him, but didn't immediately press it, which told Jace he wasn't completely certain about the situation. He'd expected fewer people, or different people, or something other than what he'd found. "Listen to me," Jace said. He kept his voice steady. "Blackthorne is in federal custody. Deller is in federal custody. Whatever he sent you here to do, this is over. There's nothing here to take. Reeves will be back by tonight with more men. You walk out now, you've got time to—" "Shut up," the man said. He looked back at Evelyn. "One more time. Where are the records she kept?" "Gone," Evelyn said. He moved, not toward Evelyn, sideways, fast, recalculating, toward Jace, because Jace was the one with the gun still in his hand, and that was the immediate problem to solve. Jace saw it happening and started to raise his arm, and the man's elbow caught him across the jaw, hard enough to send stars across his vision, and his pistol went sideways. He didn't drop it. He caught the man's wrist with his free hand, and they went into the wall together, and the wall was solid, and the impact was jarring, and neither of them had a clean advantage. The man was strong, thicker through the chest than Jace, with the particular solidity of someone who had done this before, and for a moment the room contracted to just the two of them struggling for position. He heard Evelyn move. He couldn't see her. The man was in the way, but he heard her cross the room fast, and then a sound he recognized. The rifle from beside the kitchen door, which was closer to the front room than he'd thought she could reach. "Let go of him." Her voice was absolutely flat, no waver in it, nothing performative. The man in Jace's grip went still. Not immediately. There was a half-second of assessment, the calculation of whether it was a bluff, and then something about the quality of her voice resolved it for him. He released his grip on Jace's wrist. Jace stepped back. His jaw ached and his vision had cleared, and he raised his pistol again and pointed it at the man's chest. Across the room, the second man still had Halsey, but Halsey had used the distraction. He'd gotten one hand to his belt, not the holster but close, and his body language had changed into the particular readiness of a man waiting for one more moment of distraction to act. It came when the first man lowered his hands. Halsey moved fast, got hold of the second man's gun arm, and drove him sideways into the corner with more controlled force than Jace would have expected from a man who'd been standing at gunpoint for the past 4 minutes. There was a brief struggle, a grunt, and then Halsey had the upper hand and didn't let go of it. The room went still. Jace stood with his pistol on the first man and breathed. His pulse was loud in his ears. His jaw was going to be bad tomorrow. Behind him, Evelyn lowered the rifle. Just slightly, not all the way, just to a position that indicated she didn't need to fire, but hadn't decided the situation was entirely resolved. "Sit down," Jace said to the man in front of him. "On the floor." The man sat. Jace looked at Evelyn. She was holding the rifle with both hands, her knuckles not quite white, looking at the two men on the floor and against the wall with the expression of someone whose body is still running on emergency and whose mind is already half a step ahead of it. She looked at him. Her eyes went to his jaw. "How bad?" she said. "I've had worse." He hadn't particularly, but it wasn't the moment for precision. She held his gaze for one extra second. Then she looked away and went to check on Cord on the porch. Reeves came back with 4 men before dark. which was faster than Jace had told her to expect. And the look on his face when he came through the door and took in the room, the two men sitting on the floor, Cord with his arm bandaged, Halsey with a bruise forming across his cheekbone, told Jace that Reeves had received word of something and pushed the return accordingly. Blackthorn's attorney filed for emergency release this afternoon, Reeves said. He set his hat on the table. He looked at the two men on the floor with a very particular expression. Judge denied it, but someone moved fast. These two didn't come from Deller's group, Jace said. No. Reeves looked at them. They're Connell's men, which means Connell is still operating independently. He paused. That's useful, actually. It means we can work him separately. Evelyn was at the table. She looked tired in a way that had finally started to show. Not broken, not diminished, but used. The way a person looks at the end of a long effort when the effort has cost them something real. You said Connell would make the calculation to cooperate, Jace said to her. He will. He just hasn't made it yet. She looked at Reeves. He sent these men before he knew how completely this had moved. Once he understands the full picture, we'll make sure he understands it, Reeves said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. He put his hands flat on the table. Are you prepared to testify? In a formal proceeding, not just an affidavit, but actually testifying in front of a federal court, under cross-examination from Blackthorn's legal team. The kitchen was quiet. Jace watched her face. He watched the question land and move through her, not with fear, but with the full weight of what it meant. She'd answered this question for Reeves once before. That had been hypothetical. This version was not. Yes, she said, it will be difficult. His attorneys are experienced and they will attack your credibility, your identity, your motivations. Everything about the past 10 years of your life will be visible. I know. There may be legal exposure for you as well. The records, the way you obtained them. I know that too. Reeves studied her. Why? He said, and the word was plain and direct, without rhetoric. Just a question. You could have handed this over and stepped back. Let the federal process carry it from here. She looked at him, and then she looked at the document box that was sitting empty on the counter now, all its contents transferred and gone. Because Garfield had 2 children, she said, and Walsh had a mother who never knew what happened to him, and Tremaine was 24 years old. She said it quietly, not for effect. Someone should be there. Someone who was in that room, who saw the records, who knows what it costs. Someone should stand up in that court and say, I was there. I saw this. I know it to be true. She paused. It should be me. The kitchen held that for a moment. Reeves nodded slowly. He picked up his hat. All right, he said. We protect this property through tonight, and in the morning I want both of you in Caldwell. The courthouse in Laramie has assigned a date, 6 weeks from now. He stood up. Between now and then, we have a lot of work to do. He went back outside to organize his men. Jace and Evelyn sat in the kitchen in the quiet that followed. The fire in the stove was low. Outside, Reeves's deputies moved around the perimeter of the property with the calm efficiency of people settling in for a long night. 6 weeks, Jace said. 6 weeks, she agreed. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the ranch, the east pasture, the barn, the fence that still needed sections replaced along the north line. He thought about Clara, who deserved to know how things stood. He thought about a lot of things, and none of them seemed particularly urgent compared to the woman sitting across the table from him, who had just told a federal deputy she was ready to stand up in court and say I was there. You know, he said, when I walked into that church, I thought the worst thing that could happen was that the rest of my life would be quiet and diminished and nothing would come of it. She looked at him. I was very wrong about that, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Considerably, she agreed. I'm not... He stopped. Reorganized. I'm not complaining. I want to be clear about that. I know. She looked at him steadily. Jace, what happened today? What you did? You had the rifle. Before that, when you held on to the gun. She paused. You didn't have to be here. This was never your fight. No, he said, But it's the fight that was in front of me. He looked at her, and I told you. I don't walk away from what's in front of me. She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something in those gray-green eyes that he'd started to recognize over the past weeks. Not warmth, exactly, because warmth implied something soft, and she was not soft. Something steadier than warmth. Something that had been building in the spaces between practical conversations and late nights and coffee made at 2 in the morning without either of them naming it or pressing on it. He didn't press on it now, either. The moment didn't need it. Get some sleep, he said. We've got a long road to Laramie ahead of us. She nodded. She stood up and picked up the empty lamp from the counter and paused beside him. Your jaw, she said. I know. There's arnica in the cabinet above the sink. It'll help. She went upstairs. He sat at the table a while longer, in the way he always did at the end of a day. Not dramatic, just the body taking stock. His jaw was stiffening up. His hands had a slight tremor that he recognized as the aftermath of adrenaline, the body's way of finishing something the mind had already moved past. He went to the cabinet above the sink and found the arnica and held the cloth to his jaw and sat back down and did the inventory he always did at the end of a hard day. What was broken? What could be fixed? What needed to happen first? Blackthorne was in custody. His men were accounted for. Connell would move toward cooperation when the mathematics became clear, which they would. Reeves had 4 men on the property and the night was under control. In 6 weeks, there would be a courtroom in Laramie, and Evelyn would stand up in it and say what she'd seen, and it would cost her, and it would matter. The ranch debt was gone. The land was his. Clara was safe. None of this was how he'd imagined it, the life he'd expected to live, the diminished, quiet one he'd resigned himself to in the back room of a church, in a suit that didn't fit, hadn't materialized. Something else had materialized instead, something thornier and more complicated, and considerably more expensive in terms of jaw injuries and sleepless nights, and the ongoing education of discovering what he was made of. He thought about what Reeves had said on the porch last night, about people who get so used to carrying things alone that they forget it's possible not to. He thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table in those first days, papers arranged in their careful order, the rifle always within reach, the locked door at the end of the hall. He thought about the way she'd stepped into the front room with that rifle and said, in a voice with nothing performative in it, "Let go of him." The arnica cloth had gone warm. He set it on the table and looked at the scratch in the wood. Outside, one of Reeves's men made a circuit of the porch, and his boots were steady and unhurried on the boards. The horses in the stable were quiet. The fire in the stove ticked softly as it settled. It was not a comfortable night. It would not be a comfortable 6 weeks. The road to Laramie was long, and what waited at the end of it was real and serious, and would demand more from both of them than anything so far had demanded. But Jace Holloway had stopped expecting comfortable somewhere around the 3rd week of this marriage, and what he'd found instead of comfortable was something that held its shape under pressure, which was worth considerably more. He got up and banked the fire and went upstairs to his room. Down the hall, the door that had been locked for 2 years was open now. The room behind it no longer a vault, but just a room. The thing it had protected for so long was in federal hands, doing the work it had always been meant to do. He lay down in the dark and listened to the house, Reeves's men outside, the wind across the roof, the ordinary sounds of a night that was, for the first time in weeks, not bracing for impact. Sleep came faster than he expected. In the morning, there would be Caldwell, and the long process of building a case that would hold up in court, and all the work that serious things require. In the morning, there would be Clara to write to, and the ranch to think about, and a future that was genuinely uncertain in a way that was different from the resignation he'd carried into that church. Uncertain, but open. He hadn't felt that in a long time. He closed his eyes, and the night held the house quietly, and outside the stars were the same stars that had been overhead every night of this, indifferent and enormous and present. And somewhere in Laramie, a federal judge had issued a warrant with a man's name on it, and somewhere in the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, a box of carefully copied documents was sitting under lock and key and chain of custody, waiting to do what it had always been waiting to do. The morning would come. The work would continue. Jace slept. But 2 floors down, in the yard, something shifted. One of Reeves's deputies, the young one, Cord, arm bandaged and sore, was making his circuit of the property's south fence when he heard a horse moving on the road. Moving slow, not approaching, just moving parallel to the property, which was the thing that made him stop and listen. He stood very still in the dark. The horse stopped. Cord put his good hand on his rifle and waited. 30 seconds, a minute, nothing. He walked the fence line to the corner post and looked out at the road. Empty. Whatever it had been, rider, loose animal, his own tired ears manufacturing sound in the dark, it was gone. He stood at the corner for a long moment, looking at the empty road. Then he turned and walked back. The night was quiet. It stayed quiet. But the road was not as empty as it looked, and the morning that was coming was not as simple as the one Jace Holloway had fallen asleep expecting. Not quite yet. The rider on the road was Connell. Cord found this out in the morning when the man walked up to the gate in the early gray light, with his hands visible and his horse trailing behind him, and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has spent the night calculating and has arrived at an answer he doesn't entirely like, but has decided to live with. Arthur Connell was smaller than Jace had imagined from everything Evelyn had told him. Medium height, thinning hair, a face that had the soft, careful look of a man who had spent his working life in rooms rather than outdoors. He was maybe 55, dressed for travel rather than business, and he looked tired in the bone-deep way that comes from more than one bad night in a row. Cord had him at rifle point before he'd made it 3 steps past the gate. Jace came out at Cord's call, pistol in hand, and looked at the man standing in his yard with his hands up. "Arthur Connell," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Connell's voice was controlled but thin. "I want to speak with Deputy Reeves." "Reeves isn't here." A pause. Connell's eyes moved to the house, then back to Jace. "I want to speak with Nora. Her name is Evelyn Holloway." Another pause, longer. "I want to speak with Mrs. Holloway." Jace looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the letter. The man on the road to Denver. He thought about Evelyn in the kitchen the first night, telling him about Thomas Ridley. The careful, flat voice, the weight that lived underneath it. "Wait here," he said. He went inside. Evelyn was already up, already dressed, standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee. She'd heard the voices. "Connell," he said. She set the cup down. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it moved. "Alone?" "Alone. On foot. Hands up." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, then she said, "Bring him in." Jace brought him in. Connell came through the back door and stopped in the kitchen and looked at Evelyn across the room. She looked back at him. It was a strange thing to watch. 2 people who had shared years of proximity and mutual use and mutual danger, standing 10 feet apart in a kitchen that smelled like coffee, not quite able to settle on what expression to wear. "Sit down," Evelyn said. Connell sat. He put his hat on the table and looked at it rather than at her. "I heard about Blackthorn," he said, "last night, from someone in Caldwell who sent word." And I spent the night thinking." He looked up. "I know what the warrant covers. I know they're going for his business records in Cheyenne, and I know that when they get those records, my name is in them." He said it plainly, without drama. "I'm not a fool, Nora." "Evelyn," he corrected himself. "I know what's coming." "Then you know why you're here." "I want to cooperate." He said it with the flat directness of a man who has stripped away everything but the practical. "Full cooperation. Whatever the federal prosecution needs from me, testimony, records, access to the Cheyenne operation, I'll provide it, in exchange for consideration on my own exposure." Jace leaned against the counter and watched Evelyn's face. She was looking at Connell the way she looked at most things, carefully, without rushing, reading what was there. "3 men died," she said. "Garfield, Walsh, Tremaine." Connell's jaw tightened. "I know." "Did you know it was going to happen? Before it happened?" A long silence. The kitchen was very still. "Garfield," Connell said slowly. "I knew that there was a problem with Garfield. I knew Blackthorn was handling it." He paused. "I told myself I didn't know what handling it meant. That's not entirely true." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It's not." I know that. He looked at his hat. I've known it for 2 years. I didn't know about Walsh and Tremaine until after. By then, he stopped. There's nothing I can say about by then that makes it better. No, Evelyn agreed. There isn't. Connell was quiet. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something and had just set it down and found it weighed more than he'd realized while he was holding it. I'll tell them everything, he said, about the contracts, about the payments to the land agents, about Blackthorn's arrangement with the county officials. He paused. About what I knew regarding Garfield. That last part, Evelyn said, that's the part that matters. Anyone can hand over financial records. What matters is what you're willing to say out loud, under oath, in front of a court. I know. And you're willing to do that. He met her eyes. Yes. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and said, Reeves will be back by midday. You'll wait here. All right. You're not a prisoner, but you're not leaving. I understand. He looked down at his hat again. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that it doesn't fix anything, she said. But it's noted. She looked at Jace. Keep an eye on him. She took her coffee and went upstairs. Jace looked at Connell sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded around his hat and thought about the specific kind of person who builds a life on useful proximity to worse men and then has to sit in a room one morning and account for it. He didn't feel particular sympathy, but he understood the arithmetic of it. Sometimes people made themselves into instruments of things that outgrew them, and the reckoning came in a kitchen at 7 a.m. with a woman's flat voice saying it's noted. He poured Connell a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the table and went to stand by the window. They waited for Reeves. Reeves arrived at 11:30 with 2 additional deputies and the expression of a man who had received significant news in the last 12 hours and was still processing the implications. When Jace told him Connell was inside, Reeves stopped walking for a full 2 seconds. Then he went in. What happened in the kitchen over the next 3 hours was not dramatic in the way that the previous days had been dramatic. It was the quieter, harder work of a man agreeing to dismantle the thing he'd spent years building, statement by statement, detail by detail, with a federal deputy writing everything down in a careful hand and asking follow-up questions that were always precise and always pointed at exactly the place that hurt most. Jace stayed out of it. He worked the property. There was always something to do. And he let the process run without him. Evelyn came down once during the afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, listening. Then she went back upstairs. He didn't follow her. He understood that there were parts of this that she needed to experience in her own way, at her own distance. By the time Reeves finished with Connell, the afternoon was going amber. Reeves came out to the yard where Jace was working on the fence along the south side and stood beside him. He's going to be useful, Reeves said. Useful enough? More than enough. He had documentation I didn't know existed. Internal correspondence between Blackthorn and 2 of the land agents. Names, dates, explicit language. It's not euphemism like the Garfield letter. He paused. Combined with what she already provided, this case is as solid as I've seen in 15 years of this work. Jace set down the fence tool. And Croft? Reeves was quiet for a moment. Connell confirmed it. Croft was receiving payments from Blackthorn's operation. Not large amounts, but consistent. In exchange for information about property ownership, land transactions, who was in debt, and how badly. He paused. Your father's debt, he said carefully. The way it accumulated. Connell says Croft was feeding the information to people who had an interest in certain properties changing hands. Jace looked at the fence post in front of him. The new wood he'd put in a month ago, solid and square in the ground. Croft manufactured the pressure, he said. Not the debt itself, but the timing, the urgency. Reeves's voice was careful. I can't undo what it cost your family, but I want you to know we'll pursue it. Jace nodded. He picked up the fence tool again. He didn't trust himself to say much for a moment, so he didn't say anything. He worked the post until it was right, and then he moved to the next one. Thank you, he said finally, for moving fast. Yesterday, coming back early. I had a feeling, Reeves said simply. Men like Blackthorn always have a contingency. He went back inside. Jace kept working the fence until the light told him to stop. Eat. The 6 weeks between that afternoon and the Laramie courthouse were the strangest weeks of Jace Holloway's life, and that was a meaningful distinction given the weeks that had preceded them. They moved to Caldwell the morning after Connell gave his statement, as Reeves had wanted. The property too isolated, too exposed for two people waiting on a court date. Reeves found them rooms above a respectable boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Farrell, who asked no questions and kept good coffee on the stove. Clara came from the ranch and stayed for 2 weeks. And the reunion was the kind that doesn't involve many words. Just Clara, looking at her brother's face and the yellow-green bruise on his jaw that was still fading, and then looking at Evelyn, and then making up her mind about things in the straightforward way she'd always made up her mind about things. By the end of the first week, Clara and Evelyn were sitting at the same table having conversations that Jace wasn't part of, which he took as a good sign without examining it too closely. He rode back to the property every few days to keep the work from getting away from them. The stable needed attention. The east fence had 2 more posts that had been meaning to give up for months. He worked and thought and let the physical repetition do what it always did for him, settle the noise down to where he could hear himself. He thought about his father, about the particular cruelty of learning, this late, that the weight Dale Holloway had died under had been made heavier than it needed to be by men with agendas and silver watch chains. He thought about what his father might have done with that information, and decided that Dale would have been angry for a while and then would have gotten back to work, because that was what Dale did. It was a form of stubbornness that Jace had inherited without meaning to, and he was glad of it. He thought about Evelyn, Nora, and the distance between those 2 names, and what it cost a person to put that much space between who they'd been and who they had to become. He thought about the room at the end of the hall, locked for 2 years, and the box inside it that she'd carried from Pennsylvania to Wyoming Territory to a small homestead outside Harlan, waiting for the world to be ready for what she knew. He thought about the patience that required, the loneliness. He thought about choosing, about the difference between things that happen to you and things you decide to walk toward. He'd walked into that church believing he was being handed a sentence. What he'd actually been handed was a direction, though it had taken him a while to understand that. Most of the important things in his life had worked that way. You didn't see the shape of them until you were already inside. The Laramie Courthouse was a 2-story stone building that smelled like paper and linseed oil, and the specific solemnity of a place that takes itself seriously. Jace had never been inside a federal courtroom before. He sat in the gallery on the first day of proceedings and looked at the architecture of it. The elevated bench, the careful arrangement of tables, the high windows letting in a light that made everything look slightly more consequential than it might have in ordinary rooms, and thought that whoever designed these spaces understood something about the theater of accountability. Blackthorne's attorneys were good. There were 3 of them, all polished, all experienced, and they attacked the case the way Evelyn had predicted, through her. Her identity, her history, her motivations, the circumstances under which she'd copied the records, the years she'd spent living under a name that wasn't her own. They were not cruel about it, exactly. They were methodical, which was worse. She held up. Jace watched her from the gallery and thought he had never in his life seen anything quite like it. A woman sitting in a witness chair being taken apart piece by 3 skilled attorneys, and holding the thread of her own account together through all of it with the same patience she'd used to hold everything else together. She didn't perform composure, she just had it, the way a person has something they've earned through repeated testing. When they tried to characterize the copied records as stolen, she said, "I made copies of documents that recorded federal crimes. I made them because I intended to report those crimes, which I have done. You can call that theft if you like." When they questioned her credibility as a witness, given her assumed identity, she said, "I took another name because I was afraid of being killed. I was right to be afraid. Thomas Ridley was killed. I'm here, which means the precaution worked. My name doesn't change what's in those records." When they suggested her personal animosity toward Blackthorne compromised her testimony, she said, "I don't have personal animosity toward Mr. Blackthorne. I have accurate information about what he did, and I have the records to support it. Those are different things." Connell testified on the 3rd day. He was less steady than Evelyn. His voice caught twice when he talked about the Garfield matter, and he had to stop once and collect himself. But he was thorough, and the records he'd brought from his own files were exactly what Reeves had said they were. Explicit, detailed. Damning in the particular way that written evidence is damning when the person who wrote it believed it would never be seen in public. The land agents who had received payments came in varying degrees of willingness. 2 cooperated fully under their own arrangement with the prosecution, 1 had to be compelled, and 1 had fled the territory and was found in Colorado and brought back under warrant with the specific indignity of a man who believed he'd gotten away and discovered he was wrong. Croft entered a guilty plea on the 4th day of proceedings, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention and briefly electrified Harlan in a way that the town would talk about for years. He looked smaller when Jace saw him in the courthouse hallway. Not in any physical way, but in the particular way powerful men look smaller when the infrastructure of their power has been removed. The silver watch chain was gone. His coat was not as good. Jace looked at him and felt, not satisfaction exactly, but a settling. The particular internal quiet that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is acknowledged as wrong in a way that has consequences. Croft looked back at him with an expression that was almost apologetic and then looked away. Jace walked past him. Blackthorne was convicted on 7 counts. The judge read the verdict on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, in a courtroom that had grown familiar over the course of the proceedings. Jace was in the gallery. Reeves was at the prosecution table. Evelyn was in the witness area, having given her final testimony 2 days prior, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face showing nothing while the judge read through the counts in his careful, measured voice. Fraud against the federal government. Conspiracy to defraud. Obstruction of justice. And 3 counts related to the deaths of Garfield, Walsh, and Tremaine. Not murder, which the prosecution had pursued and been unable to fully establish to the required standard, but conspiracy to commit and cover up acts resulting in death, which carried its own weight. Blackthorne stood for the reading. He looked older than he had the day he walked into the Voss property kitchen and set his hat on a chair. The controlled certainty that had structured his face through the entire proceeding had worn down to something that was neither humble nor defeated, but simply tired. The tiredness of a man who has spent a great deal of energy maintaining a position and has finally had to let it go. When the judge finished, Blackthorne turned slightly and looked across the courtroom. He wasn't looking at his attorneys or at Reeves or at the judge. He was looking at Evelyn. She met his gaze. She held it for a moment. Then she looked away first. Not because she had to. She'd earned the right to hold that gaze as long as she wanted, but because she was done. Because looking at him was no longer the thing that needed doing. It was a small thing, and Jace nearly missed it from the gallery. But he saw it, and he understood it, and he thought that was the real ending. Not the judge's words, not the bailiff moving toward Blackthorne, not the noise that broke through the courtroom when the verdict finished being read. The real ending was Evelyn Holloway deciding she'd looked long enough and turning her face toward the window. They drove back to Harlan 2 days after the verdict, in a borrowed wagon that was not comfortable and took 3 days on roads that hadn't improved for not being used in the proceedings. Claire had gone ahead a week earlier to see to the ranch. She'd been spending time there, keeping things from getting too far ahead of them. And she'd written that the house was in reasonable shape and that old Pete Sugro had been helping without being asked, which sounded exactly like Pete. The drive was long and occasionally tedious in the way long drives are, and they talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and the quiet was the comfortable kind that develops between people who've run out of the need to fill it. On the second afternoon, somewhere in the open country between the mountains and the flat, Evelyn said, "I've been thinking about the property. The Voss place? It needs a new name." She was looking at the road ahead. "It was Edgar's before it was mine, and I've been living there as someone else for 2 years. It should have a name that belongs to what it is now." Jace thought about this. "What do you want it to be?" She considered. "I don't know yet. Something that fits the land." She paused. "Not something grand. Just something true." He nodded. "We'll figure it out." She looked at him. "We," she said, and it wasn't exactly a question. "Unless you'd prefer to figure it out alone," he said. "In which case I'll go back to the ranch and you can send me a letter when you've decided." The corner of her mouth moved. "I'll keep you around," she said. "You're useful." High praise. "It is, actually, from me." She looked back at the road. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know." He watched the road. That's one of the things I... He stopped. She waited. She didn't fill the gap or redirect. She just waited. That's one of the things I value, he said. About you. She was quiet for a moment. The road ran through a stretch of open grass, and the late afternoon light lay across it in long, flat angles that made it look like something out of a painting, except paintings of country like this always got it slightly wrong, made it too golden, too resolved. The real thing was rawer and less comfortable and considerably more honest. I don't know how to do this, she said. Not self-pitying, just factual. Whatever this is, I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten how to... I don't know how to not be managing things at a distance. You've been doing fine. I've been better since you were there to talk to in the evenings. She said it matter-of-factly, looking ahead. That surprised me. I didn't expect to need that. Jace thought about the late nights at the kitchen table. The coffee made at 2 in the morning. The conversations that started as practical and ran long after the practical parts were finished. I didn't expect a lot of things about this, he said. No, she agreed. Neither did I. They drove on in the quiet. The road curved and the mountains shifted behind them, and the light kept changing the way light does when you're out in country that has room for it. Evelyn, he said. When we get back and things settle, whatever that looks like, I'd like to... He stopped again. He wasn't good at this. He'd never had particular practice. I'd like for us to figure out what we actually are, to each other. She was quiet for a moment. Then, we're married. We are. I'm aware of that. He kept his eyes on the road. I mean, something more specific. Another quiet. The wagon moved over a rough patch and they both steadied against it. I know what you mean, she said. I've been thinking about it too. She paused. Give me time. I'm not going anywhere. I know that. She looked at him. That's not a small thing. You understand that. For me, that is not a small thing. He looked back at her. She held his gaze with those gray-green eyes, and there was nothing calculated in them right now. Just honest, which for her was the same as vulnerable, and he understood that she didn't open that particular door easily or for anyone. I understand, he said. She nodded. She looked back at the road. They drove the rest of the way in quiet that was full of things neither of them said out loud yet, because some things need to wait until you're standing still long enough to say them properly. Both of them understood this without discussing it, which was its own kind of evidence about where they'd gotten to. Harlan was different when they came back. Not transformed. Small towns don't transform, they adjust, slowly and with resistance, and the particular grace of places that have been weathering things for long enough that one more thing, however significant, gets absorbed into the ongoing texture of daily life. But the adjustment was real. Croft's office was closed. The land he'd been maneuvering to acquire quietly redistributed itself back toward the people it had been maneuvered away from, through a process that involved federal oversight and Reeves and a good deal of paperwork and the specific satisfaction of watching a system correct itself when it's given the tools to do so. 3 families who had been losing ground got it back. 2 debts that had been artificially pressured toward foreclosure were restructured under fair terms. The Holloway Ranch debt was formally cleared, the records amended to reflect what Reeves's investigation had established about how that pressure had been engineered. Clara rode out to the east pasture the day after they got back and walked the fence line and came home and sat at the kitchen table and cried quietly for about 10 minutes, and then she made dinner. Jace didn't comment on the crying, and she didn't explain it. Some things you let people have in their own way. He and Evelyn spent time at both properties through the winter. The ranch where Clara was getting the cattle operation back on its feet, and the Voss place where there was always work, and where the locked room at the end of the hall was now just a room, its door open, the afternoon light going through it like any other room in the house. Evelyn had taken the empty wooden box and put it on a shelf in the kitchen, which Jace thought was either unsentimental or deeply sentimental, and he hadn't asked which. She wrote letters, more than he'd known she had in her. Not business letters, but actual correspondence, to people she'd lost contact with over the years of moving carefully and staying small. Some letters she got back, some she didn't. She talked about the ones that came back in the evenings, over the kitchen table, in the way she talked about things that mattered, carefully, taking her time. He listened. He'd always been better at listening than talking, which turned out to be useful. One evening in December, after a hard first frost that had made the yard look like something from a different world, she told him about her mother, a woman in Pennsylvania who'd died while Evelyn was already gone, and from whom she'd never had the chance to. There was no clean ending to that sentence, and she didn't try to manufacture one. She just told him about her and stopped where the story stopped, and he didn't try to resolve it for her because it didn't resolve. You just lived with it. She would have thought this was ridiculous, Evelyn said. All of it. The frontier, the marriage of convenience, the federal trial. She looked at the fire in the stove. She would have said I always did things the hard way. Did you? She considered this seriously. Yes, she said. But the hard way was usually the honest way. And I'd rather be honest than comfortable. She paused. Most of the time. Most of the time is good enough, Jace said. She looked at him. You do that, she said. Do what? Say the thing that needs saying without making it bigger than it is. She looked at the stove. It's useful. You told me that once before, that I'm useful. Still true. He smiled at the table. High praise. Still is. They sat with the fire in the stove and the frost outside and the particular quality of a winter evening that has nowhere to be. And after a while she reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was brief, maybe 5 seconds, and she didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. But neither of them moved away from it while it lasted. Well, spring came the way it always came out here. Not gently, not with ceremony, but in fits and starts. And one day you looked at the south slope behind the stable, and the grass was coming in green, and you understood that winter was done. The Garfield family received a formal letter from the federal court in March, acknowledging the findings related to their father's death and the conspiracy that had surrounded it. Jace knew about it because Reeves had written to tell him it was happening. He didn't know what the letter said exactly, or what it meant to those children who had grown up without a father and now had a piece of paper explaining why. He thought about it for a few days without arriving at a satisfying conclusion, and then decided that there were some things you couldn't think your way to a conclusion about. You could only do what was in front of you and hope the larger accounting balanced somewhere you couldn't see. Walsh's mother was still alive. She was old and had been told simply that her son's death had been the result of criminal conspiracy and that the men responsible had been held accountable. Reeves wrote that she'd received the news without much expression, and then she'd thanked him for coming, and then she'd asked if he wanted tea. Reeves had said yes, and she'd made it, and they'd sat in her kitchen for half an hour talking about nothing in particular. He'd written to Jace, I don't know if it helped, but she made good tea and she deserved to know the truth, and I'm glad she does. Jace read the letter twice. Then he put it in the box on the kitchen shelf, next to the empty wooden case that had held 3 years of evidence, and closed the lid. He went outside to see about the south pasture. In April, on a morning that was still cold but had the smell of something turning in it, Jace was working on the water trough on the east side of the Voss property when Evelyn came out of the house and walked across the yard toward him. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and looked out at the hills. I've been thinking about what you said, she told him, in the wagon, on the way back. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Which part? The part about figuring out what we are. She kept looking at the hills. To each other. He waited. I'm not... She stopped, started again. I spent a long time making myself into a person who didn't need things. Because needing things is dangerous when you're moving carefully and staying small. You need less, you lose less. She paused. I'm not entirely sure how to stop doing that. You don't have to stop all at once, he said. I know. She looked at him. But I think I'd like to try. With you. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. Not decorated, not hedged into meaninglessness. If that's still what you meant. It's still what I meant, he said. She nodded. She looked back at the hills. The morning light was coming in sideways across the grass, the particular low light of early spring that makes everything look like it's being seen for the first time. The property name, she said. I've been thinking about it. And? Holloway Place, she said. Simple. True. He looked at her. She was still looking at the hills, coffee cup in hand, with an expression that was as close to unguarded as he'd seen it. Not young. She wasn't young, and the years she'd lived had left their marks in the set of her jaw and the lines at the corners of her eyes, and the way she held herself, all of it earned, none of it regrettable. He thought about a church in Harlan and a suit that didn't fit and a room full of people who'd come to watch him fail. He thought about a locked door and a box of papers and a woman standing in a doorway with a rifle telling men to get off her porch without moving a single muscle in her face. He thought about the scratch in the kitchen table and coffee at 2 a.m. and the particular quality of a silence between two people who've stopped needing to fill it. He thought about his father and what Dale would have said about the year his son had just lived through. He thought Dale would have said, "You dealt with what was in front of you." And then, good. That was enough. It had always been enough. "Holloway Place," he said. "I like that." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved, and this time it didn't stop. It went all the way to something that was an actual smile, real and unpolished and brief. The smile of a woman who has been careful for so long that the muscles for it are slightly unpracticed. He thought it was the best thing he'd seen in a long time. They stood there as the morning, two people with coffee and a lot of history, and a piece of land with a new name, looking at the hills while the spring light worked its way across the grass, and neither of them said anything else for a while. There wasn't anything that needed saying. The territory spread out around them in every direction, open and indifferent and enormous. The same country that had watched 100 stories of people trying to hold on to something against the weight of forces larger than themselves. Some of those stories ended badly. The land didn't particularly distinguish. It just kept going, season after season, under whatever sky the season produced. This story had ended differently. Not cleanly. There was no clean ending for things that cost as much as this one had cost, for the Garfield children, and Walsh's mother, and Thomas Ridley's wife in Denver, and all the ordinary people who'd been players in someone else's game without ever knowing the game was being played. Those costs didn't get erased by verdicts and warrants and the satisfaction of watching a powerful man led away in circumstances that matched what he deserved. But the story had ended honestly, which was rarer than it should have been, and worth more than most people stopped to calculate. Jace Holloway had walked into a church to bury his future and had instead, by some combination of circumstance and stubbornness, and a woman who carried impossible things in a wooden box and refused to let them go, walked into the rest of his life. He hadn't seen it coming. He was glad of it anyway. The hills were green in the morning, and the coffee was warm, and the name of the place they were standing on was true. For now, that was everything.